Hi, everyone. My name's Carmen. I'm from Buffalo Street Books, and I'm here interviewing Annette Clapsaddle to talk about her debut novel, Even As We Breathe, we meet 19-year-old County Sequoia, who is hoping to leave the North Carolina reservation of Qualla Boundary, where he spent his whole life, so he can try to make it on his own. That's my brief summary. Annette, if you don't mind providing your own pitch for the book so people who haven't read it can get a sense of what it's about, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. This is actually an ARC copy. This is not the hard copy, but it's what I have handy.
I have the hard copy.
Oh, there we go. Even As We Breathe is set in the summer of 1942 when the Grove Park Inn, which is an upper class resort in Western North Carolina. So in 1942, the Grove Park Inn held Axis diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war just over one summer. And so in my novel, the protagonist, County Sequoia, is joined by, who is a 19-year-old Cherokee man, is joined by a young woman, Essie. She's also Cherokee. And they travel to the Grove Park Inn to work there that summer. County is working as a member of the grounds crew at the Grove Park Inn, and he is accused of being involved in the disappearance of a diplomat's daughter. In the midst of all of this, he is also trying to unravel the mystery of his family. His father was killed at the tail end of World War I, and his mother died shortly after County was born. So County is trying to understand kind of his own origin story, figure out where he wants to go with the rest of his life. But because of some betrayals, he is left to be a suspect in the midst of a prisoner that a prison that the Grove Park has become that summer.
So I'm curious, this is such a multi-layered and faceted book. Where did you get the idea for it? What was the inspiration? Was it something that had been stewing in your head for a while, or did it just kind of pop up and you knew you had to write about it?
So I had read an article a few years back about the Biltmore House, which is another iconic site in Asheville, North Carolina. We're talking Western North Carolina. And the Biltmore House had held precious works of art safeguard during World War II. It's kind of similar to, if you've watched the movie Monuments Men or read the book, it talks about protecting these works of art. So the Biltmore House had done that. There was an article about that, but there was this tiny little paragraph about the Grove Park Inn's role during World War II with these Axis diplomats. And I found that fascinating because I've grown up in Western North Carolina and I've lived here most of my life and had never heard the story. And then I started thinking about its proximity to Cherokee, North Carolina, where I live, specifically the Qualla Boundary that most people refer to as the Cherokee Indian Reservation. That's where my tribe, the seat of my tribe is. And I was fascinated by all of these issues of diplomacy and identity and citizenship. And so, with our tribe being a sovereign nation within a close proximity to the Grove Park, which was housing Axis diplomats as prisoners, it seemed like a really interesting setting to talk about these issues of race and identity and who belongs and when they belong. So that concept came about because of that article. Additionally, I had given myself a writing prompt to write as long as I could about the most basic object I could think of. I was coming off another novel manuscript that was going to be published and then wasn't, and I needed something new. So I put myself in this tiny little room in a library and gave myself that prompt. And I keep a James Baldwin quote handy, which is to write, the part of the quote that sticks out is to write a sentence as clean as a bone. And I'm pretty sure that is the reason why I decided to write about a bone as long as I could. And if you've read the book, you know that a bone really structures the plot in general, and so, in fact, the prologue of the novel is largely a result of that session I spent in a small room writing as long as I could about a clean bone.
I definitely want to talk about the bone. And I also am curious, I didn't have this question planned, but is a writing prompt, giving yourself that assignment, is something that you usually do? Is that how you start off most of your writing projects?
No, well, I think maybe to start them, yes. Or if I'm kind of playing around with different ideas, especially if I'm like at a writing retreat or workshop, I might do that. I was really at a place where I didn't know exactly what direction I wanted to go in, and I needed a new project. Like I had mentioned, my first manuscript was kind of like at this halt, and I needed to put it aside, shelve it, and so I just wanted something fresh, and so I don't always use a prompt to start writing, because I usually have more to write about than I have time to write. But it just kind of got me unstuck in that period of my life.
Hmm. How much from that initial prompt that you gave yourself about the bone do you feel ended up in the book?
Can you say the last part again? You cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just curious how much from that initial prompt, writing about the bone, ended up in As We Breathe.
I would say 90% of it. That
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that the prologue in particular, it is almost directly a result from that initial session. And then I actually extracted some and put it elsewhere in the novel, but it was pretty formative.
Yeah, it sounds formative. It's a really process. I might steal it from you. um, the next question I had, the next question I had kind of relates to you talking about only being able to find that one small paragraph about the setting that you ended up writing about. I'm curious what your research process in general was like because of how much this book utilizes Cherokee culture and Cherokee history. I know that I've had time finding sources on histories and cultures in general, so I was curious what that process was like for you.
Well, I'm fortunate enough that I live in the midst of it and have my entire life. So, in terms of Cherokee culture specifically, a lot of that is conversational in terms of the history. And let me back up just a second and say that that period of history, that summer in 1942. There are not a lot of records regarding the Grove Park's role, and it makes sense. I mean, you're not going to allow media into the Grove Park when they're holding Axis diplomats, probably in 1942. There's just not a lot of two-way communication, and a lot of those folks after they were released, obviously returned back to their home countries. So there was just not a lot of recorded information. So I didn't even have the option to go to the archives, which I kind of, I like as a fiction writer. I like to be able to fill in the gaps in a way that makes the narrative work, as long as nothing is too overtly inaccurate. So I spent a lot of time looking at photographs, actually. I read, in terms of written material, I did read articles of the period to get a sense of, what people knew and what people were talking about that summer, because I think we can assume things about what people knew, but when you're in the midst of war, you don't know as much as obviously we know now. So I did read newspaper articles just in general from the region, but looked at a lot of photographs because landscape is so important to me. I spent a lot of time thinking about roads and how long it takes to get places, what products were not only in existence, but also accessible to the people in rural Western North Carolina. Because, I'm talking probably to folks who are not familiar with our area. We are in the Great Smoky Mountain, like at the entrance to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the Appalachian region of the Southeast. And so even now we're very rural, but in 1942 we were exceptionally rural. So a lot of folks now are familiar with Asheville, North Carolina, but that was not the case in 1942.
Yeah. How much of your personal experience living in the area did you depend on for the book, since the research process was limited by the fact that not a lot of records were available from this time period?
I think quite a bit of my own experience is embedded in the book. Obviously, I wasn't alive then, and didn't go through the experiences that my character did. But again, because landscape is so important to me, I spend a lot of time outside in our environment anyway. I mountain bike, I hike and swim. And so those things haven't changed. Our mountains have not changed. Our rivers have not changed. In a lot of ways, I think it's good. Sometimes it's not. Cherokee has not changed all that much. So my experience with it is not all that different than what my character's experience would have been. And for example, there's a fire in the book. There's kind of this kind of constant backdrop of these wildfires that have started. And that came about because in the midst of writing this novel, we had terrible forest fires in Western North Carolina. They devastated some areas. And that feeling of every day waking up to the pressure of that smoke, the color of the sky, that smell in the air, that completely influenced me adding that into the book. Was there a fire in 1942? I have no evidence of that. But I will take kind of my experiences in present day and use them to affect the mood I'm setting in, and then also some character motivations. I mean, I feel like I know these people, the Cherokee characters in particular.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's one of the wonderful powers of fiction, is being able to pull from our personal experiences and put them into this world in a way that makes sense. So one question I had also about your personal experiences and how they relate to the book. County, obviously a very different person from. How did you decide that a 19-year-old boy going through this kind of evolving journey was the right person to tell this story?
I knew that I wanted a young protagonist, or fairly young protagonist, that would be coming of age, primarily because I wanted him to kind of walk hand in hand with the reader in encountering this kind of a hotbed of cultural questions, right? Like, new to some of these discussions and conflicts of race, new to these discussions of what it means to be a citizen in the United States. So I didn't want my character to be jaded by too many past experiences. And then why a young man as opposed to woman. I teach high school at Swain County High School. It's a public school in our area, and I feel like I have taught county over and over and over again. I love that age for specifically young men who are trying to figure out what they want to do. And I've taught so many of these students who are super smart in different kinds of ways, but really, school is school, and they're not about um, fitting into that box, but I know that they have the potential, and then I see how they really flourish, kind of the years following high school. So I guess I kind of have a soft spot for that transformation that happens at that age. And I think that it serves the reader well to kind of walk that path with them as a way to kind of self-discover. And I love my female characters, and sometimes I start out with a male protagonist, and my female characters will some almost overshadow at times the male characters. But this voice from the get-go really was a young man from Cherokee who was trying to figure out life in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially since we're dealing with such heavy topics, like you mentioned, not wanting county to be clouded by conflicts of race, cultural questions, things that we can kind of follow and learn alongside him. And yet, there's all of these really heavy things in the book. There's also moments of humor, and I noticed Cherokee-specific humor. So I was curious about the role that humor plays in allowing for these dark things to exist without being overwhelming, and how you decided to fit that in, and how you stayed true to the Cherokee nature of that humor as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. That's perceptive to pick up on that. We have 7 core values in our Cherokee culture, and one of those 7 is a sense of humor. It's highly valued in our culture, and it is in a lot of cultures, really, especially cultures who have dealt with, the heaviest of issues like genocide. um, and, it is such a part of our community when we interact with each other. I know that I am accepted in a group, or now have a good relationship with a person in Cherokee if they pick on me, or if we, kind of joke back and forth. If I am in a meeting in Cherokee and I'm not joking with the people at the table, then that meeting is not going well. So there's that very natural aspect of our community, but also just to balance out the heaviness of some of the really difficult experiences our tribe has had. And and I think that's really why we believe in a sense of humor. I think it is that that sense that we want to strive for a balance, and the best way to strive for a balance is to bring in the humor to help bring levity, literal levelness to a situation. And so, I think about this a lot, and I'm actually in what I'm writing right now. I was writing a funeral scene, and I was thinking about my own experiences at funerals and how many jokes are told at funerals. That the saddest of times are often coupled with people telling jokes and laughter, not in a disrespectful way, but I think it just helps people to find that balance. And that's true of more cultures than just Cherokee, but it's part of our culture.
Well, I think what you said about it being particularly true for cultures that have historically faced hardships is really like really true. And I've experienced that in my own life. There's a comfort to being able to laugh that is
Mhm,
hard to find through anything but humor.
mhm.
Um, this is kind of potentially jumping ahead a little bit book, but I was curious if you had a favorite character. I knew mine was Lishi as soon as she talked about wanting to be buried in the same place as County and the relationships between their bones mingling. Like she just feels so much like home and placehood, and I really related to her. And I was curious who your favorite character is and why.
Oh. Um, all right, well, I can't say I have a favorite character because I love them all for very different reasons. Um, one of one of the characters that always makes me smile that might be unexpected to say is Zadzi. And Zadzi is the old man who
Yeah.
owns the capuchin monkey Edgar. And I just love Zadzi. He's not in the book a lot. But I love him because I can see him so clearly in my head. Like I know this guy. Um, and I love that he is unassuming and humble and also brings some of the most important knowledge, I think, to County. So I love Zadzi very much. He's also Zadzi is the Cherokee name for George, and George is my oldest nephew. So maybe there's a little bit of um, connection there. But I also love Lishi. I love all my characters. Lots of people don't like Essie. I have a colleague, and when so she was reading the book, and I came out of my classroom, and I was just standing outside my classroom door, and she came around the corner, and we just kind of acknowledged each other, and she was going to her room, and then she came back and she looked at me straight faced and said, "I hate Essie," and then just kept walking, which is great. Like I just
Oh my God.
however you feel about them, if it elicits emotion, that is great, even if you don't like them. But I also probably like Essie more than a lot of readers like Essie, because I think she deserves as much opportunity as anybody else to make her own decisions based on what she values. And I don't want to give anything away, but I know that readers want Essie to do different things than she does, but she doesn't.
Yeah. I have to say, as a reader, I did want to do different things than she did, but I can also understand kind of needing a character that makes decisions differently than how you would expect.
Yes, yes, yeah. I didn't want it to be expected. Yeah.
um, so now knowing that one of the characters, their name is softly based off of someone you know, are there other characters that followed this rules? Did you pull a lot from people in your life?
Um, so I like name. I love playing with names. Most of the names are people I know or family names. County is a family name on my dad's side. A relative, I guess it would be a great uncle of his. Um, Essie is my great grandmother's name. Um, I named let's see, Lee. Lee. I'm trying. It's funny at this point. I forget what gets edited out, but Lee in the book serves a couple of roles. If you look at his full name in the book, it actually is. I can't remember. I hope this didn't get edited out. It's actually a name of a bone. Yeah, I don't know what gets. I can't remember at this point. But his full name really is the name of a bone, which is a reference. But he gets called Lee the whole time. And I had a good friend in college, in high school, who I think about a lot because he was very smart and ended up dropping out of school our senior year, and like the end of our senior year, and it's one of those situations where this school wasn't right for him. But I'll, I'll get in trouble for telling this story, but I'll tell it since this is a bookstore in a different state. Maybe people won't hear this in my hometown, but one of my mentors, yeah, one of my mentors is Charles Frazier. He's the author of Cold Mountain, and from our region. And when I was in high school, I was supposed to do a book report, this is long before I met him, on Cold Mountain. And I was sitting in our high school library, and I have Cold Mountain out in front of me. I'm like, I've got like an hour before I'm supposed to turn in this like book report. And I hadn't read the book. And my friend Lee walks in, and he's just kind of like a good old boy. Likes to go hunting and plays football and skipping class all the time. And looks at me and says, I read that book. And I said, shut up, you didn't read this book. And he said, yeah, I read that book. And I said, tell me about the book. I've got like an hour before this paper is due. And he told me all about it. He had read it. And it's just like this reminder to me that people are so complex, and to stop putting them in boxes. And I just, I wanted to name that character after him in part because it just seems so connected. I mean, Charles Frazier's mentorship of me has in part led to this book. And I just think it's funny that I actually hadn't read Charles Frazier's book until Lee set me straight. So anyway, that was a really long answer to your original question.
No, it's totally fine.
And those are names. So names, for the most part, are people that I have some connection to. I think a lot about names. But then in terms of like their characteristics, it's mostly composite. I identify with county at points. I identify with Essie at points. I know lots of Leachies. And even the characters that we don't like so much, I know those people too. So being a writer of fiction is great because anytime I have a problem with somebody, I just think about how I will put them in a book.
That's great. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the risk to tell that story because it gives me as a reader more of a background to these characters. They have more of a meatiness. So thank you. Yeah. My next question is pretty unrelated to what we've been talking about, but circle back to the bone. So this one bone kind of carries us through the whole narrative arc of this book. And what you talked about before in the prologue is kind of dedicated to County finding. I noticed that his relationship to the bone, to the land, to the characters around him, the lines kind of are between what is body, what is fiction, what is mystery. And I'm curious about this relationship between County and the bone and how it's significant to not the world that this book is set in, but to their characters as well. If that didn't make sense, I can re-ask it as well.
I think I know, what you're asking there. So the novel in its concept was really divided into these sections of I think of it, and there's a much nicer way to say it, I'm sure, but I always thought of it as bone, blood, and skin. And the reason I thought of it in those three kind of sections of the book is that I keep coming back to this idea that we determine identity and belonging based on the most the the most superficial parts of our existence as humans, so that when we die, what is left of our body after many years, it is not going to be bone. It's not going to be blood. It's not going to be skin. It's going to be that human spirit. Um, and we make so many judgments about people, and whether they belong to our community or not, based on those three elements. And so I wanted to look at that bone in particular because there's a question throughout. When the county finds this bone, there's a question throughout: what or who does this bone belong to? Is it human? Is it animal? How long has it been there? I mean, there is reference to Cherokee people being in Asheville, prior to Asheville being Asheville. So that's, part of our ancestral homeland is where the Grove Park Inn is. And so I wanted to play with that question of what we use to determine identity other than the human spirit and human intention. And also how closely we were all related, that the county can find this bone and has no idea whether it is human or not. But yet those are that's one of those elements that we use to identify belonging.
I really like that answer, because that idea that County doesn't know whether it's animal or not, and yet he still has this connection to it, and it still plays such a large role in his journey. Like, I think that's really interesting, and it fits on really well to this element of mystery that's throughout the book. And some of that mystery is kind of unsolved at the end. And I was curious about what the role of mystery is in bidding for this book. Was it intentional for it to be kind of ambiguous? Yeah.
It's funny because when I started writing, and through most of writing the book, I never thought of it as mystery. I don't know why, but because there's a couple of mysteries in the book. And so it's the mystery part seemed to develop itself when I was thinking about character motivations. And also, I will say the end in the editing process with my editor became more of a mystery than the original draft. I have more answers in the original draft, but with conversations with my editor, we were talking about what is the message that we want this book to convey, and in order for that to really stand out, I think it's important to let the reader decide some things for themselves, and maybe even be left with some questions, because I hope that, I think every author hopes this, that when you're done reading it, you don't immediately forget about the questions that come up in the book, that they might come to mind in the future, especially when confronted with other experiences regarding race or class or identity, any of those issues that come up in our daily lives. So by not like tying a nice bow on the end necessarily on every aspect of the book, I hope that it does leave a little bit of question for the reader to continue to think about.
That's really cool that it kind of turned into a mystery through the editing process. Can you
Mhm.
speak more to the editing process and what that experience was like?
Sure. I was so incredibly fortunate that the University Press of Kentucky selected Silas House as my editor. And if you're not familiar with Silas House, he is a writer from Kentucky who has had a long career, is phenomenal. His most recent novel is Southernmost. And I had met Silas through a program that we worked on with students and authors. And then also I attend the Appalachian Writers Workshop at Hindman, Kentucky every summer for the past few years. But he is very connected with that program. And so I had met him there as well. We had a friendship based on those two experiences. And then he called, or I think he called and said they've asked him to be an editor. Would I be okay with that? Now, I don't know how many authors have an editor call and say, you mind if I'm your editor? And I don't know
Yeah.
how many have an editor who is an acclaimed author. He's a highly regarded writer, especially in our region. And so I was thrilled. And and we understood each other. Silas was born and raised in Appalachia in Kentucky. um, but he also is homosexual. And so when he came out as gay in his small community in Kentucky, he had to overcome a lot of the stereotypes, a lot of um, the resistance to who he was as a person. And then to be a writer on top of that and to talk about some of those cultural complexities of living in Appalachia as a gay man, in one regard it's very different than my experience, but in another regard it's similar to being Cherokee and Appalachia, that people just don't quite understand that Appalachia can be
Mhm.
as complex as it is. And so we really connected early on, and his process was this is just beautiful. He would read, and his edits would say something to the effect of, this isn't working. This is the reason why it's not working. And here are some options for fixing it. And which is unheard of when working with an editor. Usually it's like, this doesn't work. so
Yeah.
it was like my own personal MFA working with Silas House. And I cannot say enough. There's a decision that writers have to make if they want to go with a big press from New York City, or if they, maybe go with a smaller press. And in my case, a university press. And I have not had a moment where I have wished that I've gone with a bigger press, just because of my experience with the people from the press, specifically, also working with Silas as an editor. So he and I shared that vision. He knew I would not abide any stereotypes of Native culture and or Appalachia in general. And so there was none of that. Well, this would sell more, or you need more of this kind of imagery because this is what readers are looking for. So we really just focused on what do you want to say? How do we move the plot? And what do people need to know? That was the other thing he was very helpful with, because I know this community, but sometimes I forget that very few people know this community. And so how much
Mhm.
teaching about the community do I need to do?
That actually maps on really well to my next question. I noticed that you're an enrolled member of Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and I was wondering how your membership there informs your writing in your daily life and your ability to teach about the Cherokee.
Yeah, I mean, I think not only being an enrolled member, but also living in this community and having always lived in this community, except for when I went away for school. It's embedded in all of my writing, and not, it's not an intentional decision I make, necessarily, like, oh, I'm going to write about my community. There are so many stories that are left to be told about our people and our culture, that I want to tell. And so I think, I feel like I just have so much material. The other point I should make is that I'm the first novelist from my tribe. So, obviously there's so much material left to share, as a writer, because no one else has been published, from our tribe in terms of a novelist. And really, and to be honest with you, very few enrolled members have been published in general from the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And we're, I think a lot of times Native writers get lumped in the same group in literature, and every single tribe is different, and every single culture of that tribe is different. And so, you can be reading, Louise Erdrich or Tommy Orange, or Joy Harjo, but none of them are from my culture. So, I think that we still have a lot left to be said, and it excites me to like, I feel like a translator a lot of times. I don't mean literally from Cherokee language, but to translate what our community is, in a way that speaks to another culture. I think that's what excites me.
That really resonates with me. I'm Latina, and so that is a population of people that are constantly grouped together despite being incredibly different across cultures. So to know that other people and other writers are grappling with the same kind of question is really refreshing. And I appreciate being able to read a novelist who is grappling with those questions, because I think they're important ones. This is kind of a complete change of topic, but I am curious what it was like releasing a book in the middle of the pandemic.
Well,
I know, very different conversation.
Here's what I've come to, I think, believe about this. Because this was my debut novel, I have nothing to compare it to, only what other writer friends have said. I think in the end, for me, and I cannot speak for bookstores, for me, it's been almost like, I hate to even say it, a positive experience, because, for example, I would not be in your bookstore today if it were a normal year. I wouldn't.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I wouldn't be in many of the events that I have been at, or the bookstores across the country. Like tomorrow, I'm going to be doing a virtual event for a bookstore in Denver. I'm with a university press, as I mentioned, and a debut novelist and a teacher. And so there's no budget for me to travel, really. And so what COVID has done is changed the landscape for my audience and who I can reach. But I've been really pleased with that. And then the other thing that's come of it is that other authors, it's almost like this fellowship of authors, and everybody who has a book out during COVID is just trying to find ways to work together to help each other. And, for example, in the county that I live in, there were 3 of us with debut novels out back to back from I think it was July, August, September. 3 of us who live in the same or have ties to the same county had books out, and one of them was David Joy, who I think this may have been his 4th book, and the other one was Leah Hampton, who had a collection of short stories. Both authors are fabulous, by the way. David got with our local bookstore because he knew they were struggling during this time, and said, let's do a deal where readers can purchase all 3 books, get one a month, and, cut them a little break. And so what that did was allow people who are fans of David Joy, for example, to say, well, I'll go ahead and get these other 2 books too. Or if they're fans of Leah Hampton, well, I'll get these other 2. And it really helped out the bookstore. So I'm seeing that a lot in terms of partnerships with other authors, across publishers. You don't have to be at the same event with only people who have the same publisher. And then I've just been able to be in more spaces than I would have been. Now, I do also recognize that is not true for these authors who have big time publishers. They're really hurting. Their tours were canceled, for example. And then I know books, they don't have the people in the store and that browsing that really helps with sales. So that's been my experience. I'm trying to look at it from a positive lens. I like a party, by the way. I really like a party. And so the fact that I didn't get to have a big party, really state but otherwise I'm trying to be positive.
Well, I'm glad that you've had a positive experience, and I'm glad that I was able to find your book and have you at an event at our store, because you're right, that is a positive thing that's come out of this. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the circumstances we're in right now. The only other pandemic related question I have is, do you see any parallels between where we are now and what your characters are facing in the book?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, because I teach high school, I think about what in the literature that I teach in high school, I think about what is the quality of literature that lasts. And so, this is a historical fiction novel, but I don't want it to have messages that are stuck in 1942. And so when I think about 2020 and the story about, the novel in general, I think about the question of how do we care for each other as humans, not in a global perspective, as opposed to, well, this is this community and they need to figure it out. This is this community, they need to figure it out. What can we do from a human perspective to care for one another? Because this really is, I'm trying to cycle through my historical knowledge right now, but this is one of those rare moments where the entire world is experiencing the same or similar hardships. And it's a real opportunity for us to think about humanity on a global perspective, as opposed to these lines that we have drawn politically, and how better served we are when we think along those lines, as opposed to just protecting ourselves or making sure that we don't look so bad compared to someone else, for example. So I hope that some of the themes of the novel can translate. And then certainly, outside of pandemic, how we think about class, how we think about citizenship. And I keep mentioning citizenship because one of the reasons why I think it's important to include this Native character is because Native Americans were one of the last groups to receive U.S. citizenship, and definitely the last to receive the rights of citizenship, such as voting in every state in the Union. When you think about Native people as being the first people on this land and being denied rights the longest, it's really remarkable. And then if you also consider that Native Americans serve in the U.S. military at higher rates than any other group in the country, it is incredible to me that that those rights as citizens were denied for so long. So it's a real complex historical question about who belongs on this land, literally on this land, who is granted rights of citizenship, and what it means to be a citizen and serve your country.
Mm-hmm. Are you working on anything new? Do you have any upcoming books that we should be keeping an eye for?
I am. I don't know if you should keep an eye out for them. You might go blind waiting, but I'm working on my next novel. I won't say too much about it, but I will say that it's likely set in a contemporary setting. Although the big question of is it pre or post COVID, I don't know yet, because that's a whole nother thing. And it's a female protagonist, and I'm thinking about the values that are conveyed in our traditional Cherokee stories, like our origin stories, and how those translate to contemporary issues in our community. And so it's not a retelling of some of those origin stories, but thematically it's going to be, I think it's going to be infused with those origin stories, if that makes sense. But very early on in the process, I do have, if you want to read more, I've got op-eds out and things like that. I did do a lot of writing about how our tribe addressed COVID, actually, because we did some really innovative, unique things, and have had better results than the state of North Carolina and Western North Carolina in general, and certainly been more successful in managing and like keeping COVID case numbers down compared to Indian country. I should say this: we have more resources available to us than a lot of Indian country. And that's one of the main reasons.
Where would I go to find this writing?
So the biggest piece I did on the EBCI and COVID is in the Atlantic. They yeah, the Atlantic and Lit Hub, and 100 Days of Appalachia. I think all three of those had those kind of stories.
Yeah. Have you found any changes to your writing process and any changes to how you're grappling with these big questions in the context of the pandemic and not being able to access people in the same way as before?
Yeah, I've really struggled both with writing and reading during the pandemic. And I've talked to other writers who've had similar experiences, and I can't quite figure it out, because especially, if we think about, as a school teacher, we shut down in March, and I was home doing virtual through the summer. Now I'm in person now with all kinds of restrictions, but so technically I should have had more time and quiet space to read and write, but it didn't feel like it. I mean, I had a hard time concentrating on reading. I started a lot of books that I set down, and it's not because of the quality of the book. It was just like my own brain. And I'm actually kind of thankful that the book came out when it did, because I transitioned to writing these op-eds and doing these events and focused on getting the book out. And actually, I guess prior to that, finishing up the editing process. So that was very task oriented for me. But like create new fiction has been difficult. I've spent a lot of I've laid out the novel, the structure and everything, but the actual writing process of it, the real creative, putting the words down on paper, really on the screen, has been more difficult during this. I think it's just the overwhelming stress of everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely don't think you're alone in this sentiment and this kind of need to adapt to a time that feels unadaptable. I think it's been a challenge for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, final question for you. I was curious if you have any book recommendations, things that you've read in the last few months, or things that you think your readers would like based off of Even As We Breathe.
Sure. I keep a stack by me because I'm really bad at remembering authors' names. All right. First one. The Prettiest Star, my screen's weird, by Carter Sickles. It is really good. And it is about, I think is it the 80s or 90s? Yeah, 86. The main character is from Appalachia, and he moves to New York City for a period of time, but then comes home because he is HIV positive. And so it's about his experience returning home to a small town in Appalachia in the 80s, when not a whole lot was understood about HIV and AIDS, and how he copes with that. It's a phenomenal book. Also, in terms of other Native writers, that this year there's been several great books out by Native writers. Kelly Jo Ford is a Cherokee writer, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, different tribe than ours, but we are related by our Cherokee ancestry. And this is Crooked Hallelujah, and it's a family saga about I think it's like 3 generations of Cherokee women in Oklahoma, and their experience with this cross culture of Cherokee and white culture in rural Oklahoma. It talks about issues of religion and kind of grappling with being a woman who is both Cherokee and in this rural part of Oklahoma. Let's see, I've read those 2 most recently. And then I mentioned. I guess I can. Yeah, y'all are not in the South in the Bible Belt like I am, so I can tell you this. My friend and I mentioned before, Leah Hampton, that has a short story collection out. This is, I swear to you, not just because she is my friend, this is one of the best short story collections I have ever come across. Like, I will use, you're going to laugh when I tell you this after you see the title. I use this with my AP Lit students just to teach them the craft of short story writing. But brace yourself, because the title is bold.
Okay. Oh, I've heard of this book.
Yeah, it's great. Yes.
It looks so good. I've been really curious about it.
Yeah. So
what a title.
Yeah, I know. And that's the other thing I've kind of discovered during COVID, is that if my attention span is waning from a novel, if I go to short stories, that will help me through, right? Because I can just read a short story, and then and then pick up the next one when I'm ready. But that's one of my favorite books of the year.
What great recommendations. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me tonight. Once again, Even As We Breathe, a very beautiful book by Annette Clapsaddle, available on our website. Thank you so much. This is really a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay. Have a good one.
All right, you too.
Bye.